necessary to destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now 9:10 p.m. in a very dark and wet Budapest. And 2 weeks to go before that grim weekend, we turn the clocks back, and then we can forget about daylight altogether. We can just get used to living in the dark for the next 3-4 months, being thoroughly depressed, and given the sort of the climate here in Budapest, it's no surprise that Hungary used to be the world champion in suicide rates. It isn't anymore, but it's still high up there. It's still punching above its weight when it comes to its suicide rate. So on that very cheery note, welcome everybody to the Gaggle. Really happy that you're able to join me. And there's a lot to talk about. And one thing that we can start off with is the meeting that took place yesterday in the European Parliament. It was the confrontation between Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. But of course, a lot of other people joined in, including Manfred Weber, who is a German Christian Democrat and who is the leader of the European People's Party bloc within the European Parliament. And this was a very ugly confrontation because it started off, and we talked about it with Peter yesterday. So it started off with Orban giving his little speech about the Hungary's rotating presidency. Hungary is currently the president of the EU Council for 6 months. So it's about halfway through its stint in office. And of course, he's already been attacked for going on his peace missions. You remember, he went to Ukraine, he went to Moscow, he went to China, and then he went to see Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago. And of course, he was furiously denounced for all of that. And as you know, he's very critical, to say the least, of the EU stance on Ukraine, and has been really from the start of the so-called special military operations. But what was interesting is that when he gave his speech yesterday, introducing, I guess, the issues that he thinks the EU faces, he really didn't say very much about Ukraine. I mean, but most people thought that, well, he'd talk about Ukraine, about peace and so on, but he really didn't do that. He spoke mainly about competitiveness and mass migration. Now, competitiveness is obviously a sore point in the EU because, of course, the EU is dramatically losing what competitive edge it ever had in relation to China and the United States. And he said, well, this is really appalling. And of course, it is appalling because, when it comes to all the cutting edge industries, whether it's computers, the internet, and social media, I mean, the EU is nowhere. Artificial intelligence, EU is nowhere. Biogenetic engineering, EU is nowhere. So, everywhere somebody else is at the cutting edge. And it's not because the EU doesn't have resources. Of course, the EU has resources, but it just simply isn't at the cutting edge of anything. So that was already bad enough, and that's a familiar story. But it was compounded by the sanctions that the EU imposed against Russia, that led to exorbitant energy prices, and that's really making the EU very uncompetitive because now energy prices are 4 times what they are, or energy costs rather, about 4 times what they are in the United States. So the EU has cut itself off from Russian oil, Russian coal, Russian gas, and now is dependent on the liquefied natural gas coming from the United States. The United States is really doing very well as a consequence. So it's really been quite a remarkable auto de fe on the part of the EU. So he pointed that out, and then of course he pointed out the issue of the mass migrations, a long-standing issue, and that the EU has not brought its borders under any kind of a control, and so therefore basically is going to have to eventually get rid of the Schengen zone, because otherwise it's just, people just, migrants just come into the country and then they can just travel anywhere within Europe. So he made these points, and then he sat down, and then Ursula von der Leyen launched into this tirade against Orban and Hungary in particular, and she started off obviously bringing up Ukraine. As I say, he didn't talk about Ukraine. He talked about the sanctions policy that the EU had imposed and how it's damaged European competitiveness, but he didn't talk about Ukraine. She said, no, there's a Ukraine, got to start with Ukraine. And she then accused Orban of blaming the victim for what was done to him, the victim. So in other words, saying, well, if you're going to blame Ukraine for being aggressed against, then you would have to blame the Hungarians for being aggressed against in 1956, and the Czechs and the Slovaks for being aggressed against in 68, and then she brought up even Lithuania in 1991. Now that's really a very sore point, bringing up Hungary in 56, and of course she knew it, and that's why she brought it up, because, as you may know, there was a little bit of a controversy in the last 2 weeks between, involving Balázs Orban. Balázs Orban is a political director in Viktor Orban's office, but he's no relation to Viktor. They just have the same name. So Balázs Orban is Viktor's political director. But anyway, what Balázs Orban said in an interview was that he, and I guess he was also suggesting that the Hungarian government would not have advised Ukraine to fight Russia in 2022. And he said, well, we had a very bad experience in 56, so we wouldn't advise anyone to fight against Russia. So this comment, of course, elicited a furious response, because it seemed as if Balázs Orban was essentially saying that the Hungarian freedom fighters of 1956, who everybody worshipped throughout the world in 56, and then of course Hungarians, swear by the freedom fighters of 56. So he was pretty much saying, it seemed as if he was saying that it was a kind of a pointless fight on the part of those Hungarian freedom fighters, and that is sacrilege in Hungary. Now, Balázs Orban wasn't quite saying that, but what he did suggest, and that is an important issue, is that the freedom fighters of 56 were delusional in thinking that the Americans were going to come in and fight on their behalf, and that's obviously a kind of a parallel for Ukraine. The Ukrainians who thought, well, we're going to just fight and die in thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and that somebody is going to come in and fight on our behalf. But he obviously came, he came under attack by suggesting that, well, hey, you are insulting the memory of the freedom fighters in '56, who just fought so bravely, and you're suggesting that they shouldn't have done so. Now, the truth is that it was the resistance in '56 was obviously very brave, and kind of obviously involved heroism on the part of the Hungarians, but it was kind of futile. I mean, it was futile, first of all, because nobody was going to come in to fight for the Hungarians. It was, Eisenhower ruled it out. Eisenhower said this is, it would be mad. It would involve going to a world war with the Soviet Union. But there were other aspects to it, which, of course, that Hungary had been, it was part of the deal between Stalin and Churchill. You remember Stalin and Churchill had a kind of wartime deal. It was October 1944. Churchill went to Moscow, and he was trying to work out some kind of a deal with Stalin after the war as to how the Europe would be divided up, and so they came to this famous percentages agreement. Now, Poland wasn't even part of the percentages agreement because Poland was just simply written off, and it was assumed Stalin was going to determine the outcome of Poland. But then the question, well, what about the rest? So they came to this deal. And Churchill wrote this down. Churchill wrote down Romania 90% Soviet, 10% British, and Bulgaria 75% Soviet, 25% British, and Hungary initially was written down as Hungary was 50-50. As was Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was also 50-50. But then it was changed because it was realized that Britain really didn't have much of any real prospect of having any influence at all in Hungary. Hungary was basically taken over by it hadn't yet been, but it would be taken over by the Red Army after a very ferocious fight. But then, so it was changed from 50-50 to 75-25. So Hungary was going to be 75% Soviet, 25% British. Now, when you have something like this, 90% Soviet, 10% British, 75% Soviet, 25% British, I mean, it's accepted. In other words, it'll be the Soviet Union. I mean, what is 25%? It does 10%. Doesn't mean anything. And that's for Yugoslavia, 50-50. It was, up for grabs. That's what it means. It was up for grabs. It was up for grabs. I mean, it wasn't immediately clear how it would go because, of course, the British were very actively involved in, fighting with the partisans of Tito. They switched from supporting the Chetniks to supporting Tito's partisans, who were obviously communists. But the British thought, oh well, they're fighting the Germans far more effectively than the Chetniks were. And I should say also that Greece was 90-10, so 90% British, 10% Soviet. And then when they wrote it down on a piece of paper, Churchill gave Stalin that piece of paper, and Stalin put a blue tick, on that piece of paper, and then Churchill said, "Well, this is what should we do with this? This is really pretty explosive. This little document. Shall we just burn it?" And Stalin said, "No, you keep it." And that piece of paper exists. It's in one of the wartime museums. I'm not sure where exactly, but the paper exists. Churchill wrote about it in his history of the Second World War. But the point I'm making here is that it was decided then, accepted by the British, and the Americans didn't really raise any objections, that Hungary was signed over to the Soviet Union. So for the United States or the West in any way to get involved in Hungary in 56 would have been a violation of the agreements that they had come to with Stalin during the war. And keep in mind, Stalin had kept his side of the bargain, because Stalin did not get involved in the Greek Civil War. Basically, the Greek communists tried to take over in Greece, and the British and the Americans just stepped in and just gave the Greek communists a terrible beating. Soviet Union didn't do anything. Not only did the Soviet Union not do anything to help the Greek communists, the Soviet Union instructed Tito not to get involved, because Tito wanted to get involved and on behalf of the Greek communists, and basically the Soviets said, no, stay out of it. It's nothing to do with you. Stay out of Greece. So essentially, for the British and the Americans to get involved in Hungary, they would violate an agreement that Stalin himself had adhered to. So that was the aspect of it. The other problem for Hungary in 56 was, I mean, of course, Balázs Orban couldn't really raise any of these issues. I mean, the only thing he could say, oh, well, it didn't really work out for us very well in 56 because nobody came to our assistance. That's fine. That's safe. And Hungarians have been complaining, for 7 decades now about, that they were let down in 56. But he can't really bring up the percentages agreement, because that would really be quite upsetting. But the other thing that he can't really bring up, it was that, Hungary was on the Axis side in World War II. And Hungary had taken part in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hungary had fought quite tenaciously during the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Hungarians had fought at Stalingrad, suffered huge casualties at Stalingrad. So when the Red Army, came in the winter of 44 to 45, I mean, it's basically the Red Army was conquering an ally of Hitler's. So when in 56, which is just 10 years after the war, the Hungarian freedom fighters started chanting, Ruski Hoza, which means Russians go home, and a lot of these kind of very anti-Russian expressions. Well, the Soviets were not really going to take it very well. You said, well, you invaded us 10 years ago. What's to stop you from returning to fascism? And keep in mind, in 1955, NATO had inducted into its membership West Germany. So West Germany began rearming in 1949. The Soviets had overlooked that. Sorry, because they rearmed in 49. NATO itself was also created in 1949, but West Germany was not inducted into NATO until 1955. So once West Germany was going to be inducted into NATO, the Soviets had every reason to believe that Hungary, which only 10 years earlier had been a fascist ally, would also be inducted into NATO, as of course he would have been. So, they had reasonable concerns as to what would happen. Hungary is a strategically important country. It's slap bang, I mean, I've said this before, it's slap bang in the middle of Central Europe. It's the pathway to the Balkans, pathway to the Black Sea. And I mean, there's a good reason why Hitler chose Hungary where to make his last stand. He didn't have to do that. I mean, Germany was already in retreat everywhere in 1944, and yet nonetheless the Germans marched in. So they in March 1944, and then eventually they even overthrew Horthy in October 1944. And the Germans, up until March 1944, the Germans had not occupied Hungary, but they decided to occupy Hungary and decided this is where they were going to make their last stand. So it was a ferocious battle, before the Red Army took over in Hungary. Now, so that going back to that was, so Balázs Orban had said this. He said, first of all, that we would not have advised Ukraine to resist in 2022, and then said, well, we are, we have our own bad experiences of fighting the Russians. So so Balázs Orban, came under attack. You're betraying the memory of the heroes of '56. Obviously, the opposition attacked him, and then of course he came under attack from, yes, you guessed it, the Germans. Annalena Baerbock and all the rest of them. They attacked them. He's betraying the ideas of 1956. Now, where and then Viktor Orban himself distanced himself from Balázs Orban. He said he had made a mistake. He said, Balázs had made a mistake in the way he expressed himself. Now, he didn't fire him. He's still there as political director, but Viktor distanced himself. So there was a reason why Ursula von der Leyen brought up 56. And this was, and the issue of 56 was being brought up by repeatedly by the U.S. ambassador to Hungary, David Pressman. Whose very existence is a kind of an affront to the Hungarians. He's gay. He lives in Hungary with his husband, and it's just it's just very hard to take for Fidesz. But he always takes this opportunity to say, well, Hungary is not supporting Ukraine. That's very strange for somebody, for a country that has suffered so much at the hands of the Russians. By that, he obviously means 1956, and then of course 1849. Now, it's always very strange to to bring up 1849, because 1849, what happened was there was the uprisings in Europe in 1848, the springtime of nations, where suddenly countries were throwing off the yoke of tyranny, and it looked like, oh, the French Revolution has come back again. And of course, it didn't happen that way. While the governments initially were a little rattled, they soon restored order, except for Austria, because what had happened is that the Hungarians had become sick of being ruled by the Austrians. They rose up against the Austrians in 1848, and then they defeated the Austrians. Very heroic, but the Hungarians defeated the Austrians. And at this stage, Austria basically didn't really know what to do other than to invoke its the Holy Alliance that was forged in the aftermath of 1815. So this was the Holy Alliance, which was this a conservative, all the conservative powers were aligned to make sure that any repetition of 1789 would be met with force and fury, and they wouldn't tolerate any attempt to go back to 1789. So Austria went to its good friend Russia and said, "Hey, can you help us out? Because what else? We don't know how to handle the Hungarians." And the Russians, so always kind of naive about these things, said, "Yeah, sure. In the spirit of our Holy Alliance, we're going to do it for you. We'll do you a favor." So the Russians came in, and then they crushed the Hungarians. I think it was nothing personal. I mean, they just said, "Yeah, it's in this. This is in the spirit of this alliance. We formed this alliance in 1815. We said the conservative powers must maintain conservatism, the rule of tradition and authority." In Europe, we can't have any more of these Robespierres and Napoleons running around Europe. We're going to do it. So they came in 1849, crushed the Hungarians, and executed the leaders of the Hungarian rebels. Now, that was 175 years ago. It's kind of very strange to start talking about things that happened 175 years ago. And the fact is that in Hungary, unlike anywhere else in Eastern Europe, there really isn't any strong anti-Russian feeling. And despite all the best efforts of David Pressman and Ursula von der Leyen to get the Hungarians to hate the Russians. Well, look what they did to you in 1849. Look what they did to you in 1956. It doesn't work. I think that, particularly with Orban, I think he's much too smart to fall for that trick. I mean, saying, taking events that happened 175 years ago as if they happened yesterday, or again, now almost 70 years ago in Hungary as if they happened yesterday. So it's always kind of ridiculous. But where, so as I say, Balázs couldn't really bring up World War II. He really couldn't bring up the percentages agreement. But where I think he could make a strong case in differentiating what happened in '56 and what happened to Ukraine now is, well, first of all, you can say, Russia is not the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, that was communism, that was ideological, that was a very different situation. Also, he can say that what was on offer for us in '56 was Soviet communism ruling over our countries. In other words, it wasn't just, well, the Soviets would be happy without being neutral. As long as we were neutral, we could run our own affairs as we wanted. That wasn't on offer, because what the Soviets were demanding in '56 was a communist-run Hungary. There would have to be a communist government, and there would have to be, communist policies in Hungary. So you can say, look, in Ukraine, the Russians weren't insisting on any kind of involvement in Ukraine's internal affairs, other than protection of the minority rights of Russians, insisting that their language rights were protected. But those are basic, universal principles. They're in accord with all the various treaties and covenants on human rights and civil and political rights. So there's nothing particularly unusual in demanding that Ukraine adhere to them, and that they recognize the language and cultural rights of Russians. So obviously that would be one area of domestic policy that the Russians did insist on it was in the Istanbul agreement that was initialed. But the rest of Istanbul concerned Ukrainian neutrality and Ukraine not being a military base for hostile foreign powers. So no NATO, no American military bases, no American missiles on your territory. So that's not a bad deal. That wasn't the deal that was on offer to the Hungarians in '56. So you could have made that argument much more clearly, saying, well, that what we were fighting for '56, well, basically, we didn't want to be run by the communists, because the few years between, say, 1947, when the communists took over in Hungary, from 47 to '56, those were not good years, and we didn't want any more of that. So that was the issue. If all that the Soviets insisted on is Hungarian neutrality and basically no hostile military forces based in Hungary, I mean, then the Hungarians would have accepted it, and the Hungarians would not have fought. They said, yeah, well, that's okay. That's a reasonable one. Neutrality. What's wrong with neutrality? So that, I think, that's the big difference between Hungary in '56 and Ukraine in 2022. But of course, Pressman and Ursula von der Leyen and all these other creeps, they don't want to say that, because they suggest that somehow your right to join NATO is somehow, it's your sovereign right. It's about your independence. You cease to be an independent state if you have to declare yourself to be neutral. If you have to declare yourself, well, we're not going to join a military alliance. But of course, it's completely nonsensical. That's not what we mean by independence and sovereignty. Independence and sovereignty means essentially that internally you run your country as is your wont, but externally, as your foreign policy, I mean, you have to take into consideration the wishes of your neighbors. You can't just do whatever you want, arm yourself to the teeth, and not think about the views of your neighbors. But that was what NATO was insisting on, which is completely ridiculous. It's never, at no time in history has anyone identified sovereignty and independence as your right to do anything that you like without consideration of the views and fears and concerns of your neighbors. So that's why NATO's position was just such a ridiculous one and so untenable, and has led to this war in Ukraine. That just simply wasn't the case in '56. So Balázs, I think, could have made that case. He didn't. Victor could have made that case. He didn't. But that's why these claims, oh, well, if you were, you would experience this Russian aggression in '56, surely you would now be on the side of Ukraine. No, there really isn't any parallel. Yes, there was the history and everything else, and there's some issues there. But the most important reason why the two cases are different is that what Russia was insisting upon in 2022 was a perfectly reasonable one, and particularly reasonable in light of everything that had happened between 2014 and 2022. So that was that. So Ursula brought this up, this '56, in her speech in the European Parliament, and she knew that it would really annoy Orban, and then she went into this whole thing, which I posted on our locals page, an article by one of these pro-EU publication, You're Active or whatever it's called, by saying, "Oh, this is Ursula von der Leyen's best speech ever. It was fantastic. Zing, boom, crack. There's an uppercut. Oh, and there's a left hook, and Orban goes down for the count. She made so many devastating points. No, because what she said. Oh well, Orban. He's talks about this migration, but look, he released some smugglers, some human traffickers from prison. But the point is that it doesn't matter about the human trafficker. The issue isn't the human traffickers. The issue is the open borders. I mean, if there are open borders, then they're going to be human traffickers trying to make a huge, dollop of money in trafficking people from all over the world into Europe. That's the issue. It doesn't matter, how many of them are in prison. And he released them from prison because prison space is quite scarce in Hungary. They just simply, that's it. You can't keep people in prison forever. So, and then she talked about these Russians, that there were Russians working in Hungary, and that these Russians working in Hungary were a threat to the security of Europe. Now, these Russians who were working there, they're basically, tech geeks, whatever the hell they do, bankers, they're not exactly, people with military expertise or anything like that. But anyway, Orban pointed out that, well, we've got 7,000 of them in Hungary. There are basically 300,000 Russians working in Germany. So this German, Ursula von der Leyen, is berating us because we've got 7,000 Russians in Hungary, while you've got 300,000 of them in Germany. And then he turned to Manfred Weber. A lot of Germans here, so these Germans, they're very, very obstreperous. Some of the most severe critics of Hungary are Germans. Usually, Germans kind of on the left, particularly members of the German Greens. There's this guy Daniel Freund, who's always going on about Hungary. But anyway, he turns to Manfred Weber, and he said, "Well, the reason you're continually attacking me is that we didn't support you because you wanted to be president of the European Commission. You wanted the job of that Ursula von der Leyen is holding." And the only reason the Hungarians didn't support Manfred Weber was that Weber had said, "I don't want the support of Fidesz." So once he said that, then the Hungarians said, "Fine, we're not going to support you. We're going to support someone else." And so Manfred Weber didn't get the job. And so Orban just pointed to him right in this meeting in the European Parliament and said, "The only reason you're going on at me, you're attacking me, is you want to be sitting where Ursula von der Leyen is sitting. You want her job. And I stopped you from getting her job. Sorry, but them's the breaks." He said this in the European Parliament. It was really, really quite entertaining. So that was a kind of the entertainment. Orban is really he's kind of blazed the trail for for kind of the populist nationalist right, really not just in Europe, but I think he blazed a trail for Trump. Really, Orban was really the first to raise the whole issue of mass migration. I mean, he did that in 2015 when Angela Merkel really threw open the doors of Europe and said, "Fine, come on over. We want this mass migration." She was clearly under the influence of Soros at the time, and it was obvious from the various writings that Soros was engaging in at the time, when he was saying something like, well, yes, Europe needs to commit itself to 1 million migrants per year. He wrote this, 1 million migrants per year. The funny thing was that he wrote this precisely that, and then Orban continued to point out, oh, Soros wants Europe to take in 1 million migrants a year. And everyone said, no, Orban is lying. Orban is being, is anti-Semitic. It's all anti-Semitism. But he actually wrote this. It's not hard to do. It's not hard to find. You do a Google search and you'll find this article where he said Europe needs to commit itself to 1 million migrants per year. And so Angela Merkel embraced this. Then it comes, she changed her mind subsequently. But when Orban kind of went against her, that was when he really became kind of the deplorable, the unacceptable figure. Even though he speaks rather warmly about Merkel, I don't know why. I think she was a really terrible leader. I mean, I remember, and then Soros said, well, Angela, he wrote one of these articles, again, about 2015 or whatever. So, Angela Merkel and I learned the way he wrote it, Angela Merkel and I, putting himself at that level, Angela Merkel and I believe in an open society. We believe in an open society. Angela Merkel and I believe in an open society. So he a billionaire hedge fund manager, puts himself on the same level as an elected political leader, Angela Merkel and I. So anyway, let's take a look at some of the issues that Gagglers have raised, and so let me go to our Gaggle page. On locals. Again, whenever we do this, I always urge people, please subscribe to us on our locals. The gaggle.locals.com, which is where so many things, our members, we interact with one another, share information. You can subscribe. Ideally, you subscribe. It's not a huge amount, but there's a lot of content that you can enjoy for free. But so, please join. Thegaggle.locals.com. Very, very easy to do. Anyway, Danaki, always good to see you, Danaki. He says, Dear George, when will the people lift the hopium veil from the eyes and finally realize that Hungary is not going to leave NATO and the EU? That's true. Turkey joining BRICS does not mean leaving NATO and turning against the US. Russia is not secretly fighting the globalists, and Putin ain't coming to save us, riding his pale horse into the sunset. You're absolutely right. I mean, while we can like and we can admire aspects of Viktor Orban, as I've just pointed out, he's kind of entertaining and makes a lot of good points. But there's no question, Hungary is not leaving NATO. Hungary is not leaving the EU. And while Hungary says, oh, well, we're not going to allow our territory to be used to transit arms to Ukraine, though I'm not sure about airspace. He just says land territory. I think they're still using Hungarian airspace, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I mean, obviously that's kept secret whether the NATO is using Hungarian airspace to transport weaponry to Ukraine. But you're absolutely right. Hungarians have no appetite at all for leaving NATO and the EU, and it's very interesting because um, what do they get out of it? They don't really get out of it. I mean, even if you just listen to Orban's speeches and all the various complaints that he makes, then you say, well, what are you getting out of it? Um, you're getting much more um, from doing business from outside of the EU, um, and NATO is just putting your country into peril. I mean, because if there is going to be a war between NATO and Russia, which is a distinct possibility, which he himself, Orban, has repeatedly warned that there could well be a war between NATO and Russia over Ukraine. So if that's the case, how are you in any way benefiting from membership of NATO? Now, somebody's going to point out, and I think it's a reasonable one, that if Hungary were to exit NATO, Orban will be overthrown. There will be an armed coup against him. I mean, that's just a given. Those plans are already in place to overthrow, imprison, and I don't know, exile or execute. Probably execute, because it's an armed coup. You can just simply kill somebody. So Orban could not survive any attempt to exit NATO. And in fact, nobody has ever done this. No one has ever withdrawn from NATO, so it's just not doable. So absolutely agree. And and people say, oh well, Orban is having influence, and other parties are influenced by Orban. That may well be the case, but the fact is that those populist parties in Europe have no real plausible way of coming to power, and into serious power. In other words, that they would actually control governments and shape policy. Um, we got the Geert Wilders. He hasn't really done anything very much. We've seen Maloney. Maloney has turned out to be a dud. A dud, obviously, on the issue of migration. A complete dud on the issue of Ukraine. The National Rally in France, I think it's going to be very difficult for it to come to power. We've seen how hard it is for for Marine Le Pen's party to get to that 51% of the vote. I mean, it's almost impossible. And even if she were to do it, I have my grave doubts that she would take the serious risks involved in diverging from NATO policy. I think if Marine Le Pen were to be elected president, I think she would be another Giorgia Meloni. A lot of big talk before the election, and then nothing afterwards. And then you said Turkey joining BRICS. Turkey will not be leaving NATO. Turkey will not be leaving NATO. And the interesting thing is, when you bring up BRICS, is how absolutely ineffectual BRICS is. I saw the other day Maria Zaharova doing her usual thing, complaining about, well, that America is in the way of a peaceful settlement in Gaza and Lebanon. So the usual thing. Well, it's true enough, but what's interesting is, well, where's Russia and China in all of this? Why are Russia and China unable really to cobble together an alternative plan? Where's the BRICS peace plan? Hey, supposedly these were the states that were challenging the American-led order. Then why can't BRICS come forward with a peace plan and demand that they can have a conference sponsored by BRICS, and demand that everybody attend? Now, of course, Israel wouldn't attend, but nonetheless, that would in itself make a statement. Here's a BRICS peace conference, and Israel hasn't attended. Notice how Zelensky, the Americans, NATO, they do this. They do this regularly. They hold these peace conferences, maybe without Russia attending, and then nonetheless those things that are taken seriously. But where's the BRICS peace plan? Where's the Russia peace plan? Where's the China peace plan? So all we get are these complaints. I mean, Maria Zahara was being made a specialty of continually complaining about the Americans. But that just shows, the more she complains, it just shows that America calls all the shots. So all the talk about multipolarity this, multipolarity that, how the Western hegemony is now under threat in the way it's never been under before, and the world is changing and so on. Well, maybe there's a little bit more multipolarity than there was, say, I don't know, pick a date, 1993. That was the height of the unipolar moment. Okay, maybe it's not quite as bad as it was in 1993, but fundamentally it hasn't changed. The United States calls the shot. The Europeans follow slavishly the American lead. Whatever some small European country will quibble about this or that, but fundamentally, the West calls the shots. The West basically supports Israel, and no one else does anything. I mean, yes, South Africa did bring that genocide case against Israel, but in terms of peace, BRICS could have said, we want to hold a peace conference. Everybody has to show up, and I'm sure many of the Arab states will say, yeah, we'll show up. I mean, why wouldn't they? I mean, a lot of them want to join BRICS, however ineffective it is, but there isn't one. There's nothing. And so that whole shtick about the how American hegemony is the days of American hegemony have come and gone. Well, let's see it. It's there's no evidence for it. Anyway, then Tanaki goes on. On the other hand, all the masterful Xenon futurist fortune tellers kept predicting that the only reason Sunak called elections in July instead of December is that by August, September tops, the UK would be in an actual state of war with Russia. Yeah, that hasn't happened. Doesn't mean that it won't happen, but at the moment, it isn't the case. Look, at the moment, what's holding everything up is the American election. And first, nobody knows exactly who will win. Second, nobody knows exactly what which policy either candidate would actually pursue were they to be president. Because in both cases, both in the case of Trump and in the case of Harris, they could escalate. I mean, they could continue in the Biden way of just going on and on, or they could try and bring it to an end. We simply don't know, and I think that's why at the moment there's nothing going on. I mean, it's nothing. Basically, it's waiting for the election. I mean, there's now November, so there's basically just a little more than 3 weeks to go. So there's no point in doing anything really at this stage. So that's why these meetings, the meetings that are taking place, Zelensky doing another one of his tours, are quite pointless, because no one is going to make any decisions about using weapons or anything else until November the 5th, or at least until it's clear, however many days after November the 5th, who will be president. So, absolutely could go either way. So, we're obviously going to uh, see what happens, but uh, anything like saying, well, this isn't happening now, so therefore it won't happen. We just simply don't know. Yeah, because today Starmer seemed to rule out um, using these Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia, but he made clear that he's only ruled it out because the Americans are not willing to give the go-ahead. But that, again, that could change. After November the 5th, whether it's Trump or Harris, they might well give the go-ahead. So what happens? What Starmer's statement today is just means nothing. And then, so Robert, thank you very much for your generosity. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So Robert says, Mark Miller, also known as Smirkula, was asked by journalist Liam Cosgrove, paraphrasing, whether using Ukraine as a battering ram to try to destroy Russia was worth the risk of a world-ending nuclear war. Okay, good question. Miller declined to answer. Is it the case that the Washington neocons think they can titrate their provocations against Russia just short of triggering a nuclear war? Or is it that their case they would actually prefer the end of the world to the end of U.S. hegemony? That's a really fascinating question. I mean, the only answer that I can come up with is that they are so arrogant and so full of themselves, so convinced of their overwhelming power and of Russia's weakness and of Russia's reluctance to take on NATO and of Russia's reluctance to use nuclear weapons, that they think that they can go on escalating, and at some point Russia will back down. It's like playing chicken and think at some point Russia will back down. I think it's a very dangerous game because Russia has been very cautious all of this time. However, it's clear that Russia doesn't really bluff. I mean, there's no bluffing from Russia. I mean, I thought, as did others, that Putin it wasn't going to launch any kind of military action in 2022. I thought that he's just talking. He's just threatening the West. That this is intolerable, but he's not going to do anything. Now, partly I did think, and there I think I was right, which is that I didn't quite see how launching this military operation against Ukraine will solve Russia's problems. I mean, Russia's security problems. I just didn't quite see it. Russia's problems was with NATO, not really with Ukraine. But I figured, well, if he can just pull off a coup, a kind of a swift coup in Kiev, and topple Zelensky's government, threaten Zelensky with death or whatever, then you could just simply get them to sign on the line that is dotted, saying, yeah, that's it. Ukraine is committed to neutrality. Ukraine will not be a base for NATO forces, American forces, and then Russia will have pulled this off. But I even at the time, I thought, well, that's a high-risk strategy because a lot of things are going to go wrong just to to pull something like that off. Yeah, the Soviet Union did pull that off. Again, going back to Hungary in '56, they did that. Czechoslovakia in '68, they pulled it off. But that was the Soviet Union. Russia is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could do those things, but Russia couldn't. So that was that was a problematic. But nonetheless, my point is that Russia wasn't bluffing when it said it would take military action. I mean, it hasn't been a success, but nonetheless, it did it. I mean, and it's continued fighting this war, even though these staggering casualty numbers keep mounting up, and so Russia has not been willing to back down. So for Miller and Milley, or everyone else, or Matt Miller, or or the State Department, and all of these guys. Matt Miller, he kind of looks like Count Dracula, as Bela Lugosi would pronounce it. I am Count Dracula, which is what Matt Miller looks like. When you see his name, I sometimes confuse that with Mark Milley, thoroughly modern Milley. But yeah, this is Dracula, who's the State Department spokesman. So he's just basically spouting that same line. Putin will back down. Once Putin realizes that he cannot defeat NATO, he will back down. And that seems to me a completely ridiculous and reckless assumption, because there's just no evidence for it. There's no evidence that Russia will back down. Russia seems to be pretty good at sustaining severe casualties without backing down. I mean, this is something that Russians are actually pretty good at. It's not the most rational way of looking at things, but that's what Russia is. So therefore, the idea that we're just going to keep arming Ukraine and then Putin will come to the negotiating table, that's not the way the Russian mind works. So I don't think they think that it's going to end in a nuclear war, because fundamentally they think, well, Putin isn't going to risk a nuclear war. And this is something we've talked about. Very important is that what NATO did is shatter the whole premise of deterrence. The idea of deterrence was obviously mutually assured destruction, but fundamentally, because of mutually assured destruction, during the Cold War, it was assumed that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union would go there, would go anywhere near confronting each other militarily, because if you do, even you shoot at the other guy, with a pistol, there might be this will be the first step along a series of steps of escalation leading to a nuclear exchange, and therefore the destruction of human civilization as we know it. That was the theory of deterrence. It wasn't just mutually assured destruction. They've got these weapons, nuclear weapons. We're going to both blow up the world several times over. The question was, we're not going to go there. We're not even going to take the risk. We'll do nothing at all that will make the other one think that they can escalate. But that is gone. NATO has shattered that and has gone down the path of escalation, and they're doing something that the presidents during the Cold War had not done. They're kind of assuming that Russia will not go that extra step of using nuclear weapons. That's something they didn't do. I mean, we were talking earlier about Eisenhower. Eisenhower, when he said, no, we're not going to do anything about Hungary, Eisenhower was thinking precisely that. Yeah, the Soviet Union will use nuclear weapons. That even if there was only, it's not 100%, but let's say it's 1 chance in 10 that the Soviet Union will go to nuclear weapons. That 1 chance in 10, that was risky enough to suggest to Americans, hey, we're not going to do this. We're not going to go there. We're not even going to take that risk, a 10% chance that the Soviets would use nuclear weapons. But that's been shattered, and that's why I think the situation has been so serious that, well, once you ignore the theory of deterrence, then there's nothing. There's just nothing to stop one escalatory step after another, because basically, as I've said, I don't think NATO is prepared to step down and accept an agreement that it's refused to accept. I think that's, I mean, it may happen. I'm not saying it won't happen, but there's no, at the moment, it doesn't look like there's any willingness in NATO to accept that, to accept such an agreement. I mean, there was, excited talk today in the media. Oh, Zelensky is talking about a ceasefire and so on, and then it was immediately kind of dismissed. It was just again a lot of big talk, but it's not going to happen. There's no willingness on the part of NATO to contemplate ceasefire. They might if Ukraine was really on the brink of collapse, but it doesn't look right now as if Ukraine is on the brink of collapse. Anyway, Robert, thank you for your question, and thank you for your generosity. And Richard Phillips says, Glenn Greenwald just did a great video on Nord Stream. Hopefully the lid will come off the conspiracy at some point. This will cause a huge wedge between Europe and the GAE. Yes, I mean, I have to say I'm a little skeptical about this. Not so much about I mean, yeah, even the story I'm a little bit doubtful about, simply because this was a story that appeared in a Danish newspaper, Politiken, about some harbor master who saw American warships close to the place where the explosion happened in a few days before the explosions. They had their transponders off, and so he was very suspicious. Now, first of all, I'm always a little dubious when stories like this come out 2 years later. So this is now 2 years, and where has he been all this time? Why hasn't he come forward to say, hey, this is quite a big story. You saw these American warships. They didn't have their transponders off. They were right there where the location of the explosion, and you haven't said anything for 2 years. So that's one thing. The other thing is that isn't quite the story that that Seymour Hersh presented. Remember, Hersh presented that we had these divers, these U.S. Navy divers, who planted the explosive months and months before the actual explosion, and then it was the Norwegians who used their they somehow triggered the explosion, and somehow Norwegian used their aircraft to trigger the explosion. But the actual input from the Americans took place months and months before the actual explosion. That doesn't mean that Hersh's story has to be true, but it's not. It's a different story. I mean, if this harbor master is right, then it's a very different story from that of Hersh. The other thing is that by itself it doesn't really mean a great deal. I mean, he says he saw them, but he didn't see them actually doing anything. I mean, so look, I have no doubt that the Americans were behind this. Equally, I have no doubt that this is going to be covered up, and this will be one of these stories that will percolate up at various times every 5, 10, 15 years. We're going to read about some new developments in Nord Stream, by which time everyone had already lost interest in it. The key would always have been an immediate investigation and immediate findings. Once years go by and all sorts of witnesses are going to come forward, yeah, I saw this, that's no one's really going to believe it for the reason that I just said, which is that, well, why didn't you come forward at the time? I mean, why didn't you say this then? That might have made a difference. People would have noticed this. And the same goes for. I mean, the key was always going to be if Germany or Sweden or Denmark had investigated it properly at the time, then we might have got somewhere. But now there have been no investigations. The official story, which nobody really believes, but the official story that the Ukrainians were behind this, that's going to be the official line of the West. Ukrainians were behind it, even though we haven't identified a single Ukrainian, we haven't arrested any Ukrainian. But we can just go with this nonsensical story, and the New York Times will repeat it. So it's going to be like other stories over the years, like 9/11. People will come forward with all sorts of new evidence about 9/11, the Kennedy assassination, and we're just going to be none the wiser. I mean, that's kind of I have to be very pessimistic. I think the moment for Nord Stream I think has come and gone. Robert says, on Napolitano's show, Douglas McGregor said that Hitler tried on several occasions to negotiate a settlement during the war. Yes, that's true. Curious, I turned to JAT-GDP, which cited the Hess mission of 1941, as well as Hitler's attempt to negotiate with Stalin following the Battle of Stalingrad. Do you think Stalin had his own reasons not to negotiate, or could it be that a belligerent Churchill talked Stalin out of negotiating? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the attempts with Stalin really was serious, and that's the one I'm a little more skeptical that those were serious attempts, because there's no way that Hitler could have survived. I mean, the only thing at that stage that would have been acceptable to Stalin would have been complete German withdrawal from the Soviet Union. A complete German withdrawal from the Soviet Union would have obviously ended Hitler's regime. So I don't think that those were serious proposals. The British one, I think, is a very different case. I think that there, I think Hitler was serious about it, because once Germany had defeated Poland in September 1939, Hitler, basically turned around to the British and the French and said, "Well, it's over. The war's over. So what's the point of continuing? And if Poland is defeated, there's nothing much you can do now for Poland. I don't really have a quarrel with you, certainly with the British. I don't have a quarrel with Britain. Britain can keep its overseas empires. I'm not even asking for the return of the German colonies that were taken away from Germany in 1914. So I'm not even asking for the return of those. What's the point of continuing with this war?" And that was rejected. So those were attempts, again, not unreasonable. Hitler's party said, "Well, what are you fighting for? I mean, there's no Poland. You can't fight for something that doesn't exist." And so I think that was serious. And then when Hitler realized that he's not going to get this peace agreement, then he felt that he had to do something, because he was then in a vulnerable situation, because of course Britain and France could launch an attack on Germany, and Britain had its forces. I mean, Britain had its expeditionary force in France, so he couldn't very well just sit around and wait for Britain and France to attack Germany. So he launched his, and particularly given that the British launched their Norwegian expedition, which was a serious thing, because they were mining Norway's ports, and in order to prevent Germany to get access to iron ore from Sweden, because that was the source of Germany's iron ore. If Germany doesn't get its iron ore, then Germany can't really have its arms industry. So once he realized that Britain intended to go on fighting, I think Hitler felt that he needed to do something, and so he launched this attack on France, and which was wildly successful. No one quite expected that it would be so spectacularly successful. And then after he had done that, after he had defeated France, he again went to the British and said, well, that's it. What's the point of continuing with this war? You've lost your ally in Europe. You have no hope of invading Europe and defeating Germany. You don't have the resources for that. So let's sign an agreement again. Germany will be the dominant power in Europe. Britain will still have its own overseas colonies. And what's the point of this war? So that was that was the deal. And again, Churchill refused that deal. I mean, there were people within the government who thought this is not a bad deal. I mean, just in a sense, well, at least we won't be at war. We'll retain our empire, and we'll still be quite a rich, fairly successful country. But no, I mean, the British refused. The Churchill, in particular, refused. But so I think that was the Hess mission. I have my doubts that Hitler approved of the Hess mission. I think it's so loony that I just don't think Hitler would have signed off on it. He would, Hitler was much more realistic than that. He wouldn't have thought that there was any real prospect of Churchill doing some kind of a deal with Hess. I mean, once the die was cast, it was just unlikely that the British were going to back off unless Germany could make conditions for Britain really hopeless and intolerable. I think that's what Hitler's calculation. So I think Hess just came up with this idea himself that he would just undertake this mission. And then keep in mind, for Hess, this it turned out to be not such a bad gamble, because he he obviously was imprisoned immediately and remained in prison until his death. I think he died around 1989. He died a very old man. He died at a very old age, unlike all of the other Nazi leaders who basically were executed after the war. Hess survived, in prison, true, but nonetheless he survived. So in terms of his own life, Hess did not make a bad decision. But I just don't think that he embarked on this with under the authority of Hitler. But I say, going back to Stalin, I don't think that was serious. Because I think Hitler could not have survived. Essentially, he would have been defeated. I mean, Hitler would have been defeated at Stalingrad, and then he would have withdrawn, and that would have been total humiliation for him. So I don't think Hitler was really offered seriously. My own feeling is that if Stalin had thought that Hitler was offering a serious deal, like unconditional withdrawal from the Soviet Union, plus he'd have to pay reparations for all the damage Germany had done, then Stalin might have taken the deal, because I think Stalin would have then said, as he believed in 1939, well, let Germany fight it out with Britain. What the hell do we care, if Germany and Britain fight it out? Let them do it. So so I think that would have been not a bad offer. I think Stalin would have taken an offer if it was genuinely meant. But I don't think Stalin believed that this was a serious offer. Anyway, Ivan Grozny says, George, hope you're doing well. Thank you. Wonder what you think about the earthquake reports in Iran, and when, if any, will there be an Israeli response to Iran? Well, I think your guess is as good as mine. I mean, I had assumed that that the attack on Iran would have already occurred. You know, the Israelis don't really play a long game. You know, they need immediate psychic satisfaction. They're not a patient people. The Persians are a patient people. They can wait and wait and wait. They don't need immediate psychic satisfaction. The Israelis aren't like that. So I had assumed that it would have happened by now. It hasn't, but I think it will. It will happen shortly. I really think it will happen shortly. I mean, I know some people speculating that Israel will postpone doing anything until after the election. I find that difficult to believe, because I don't see that it makes any real difference. I mean, there's nobody at the switch at the moment in the United States. I mean, it's not like there's a president there who is willing to act decisively against Israel. So I don't think anything's going to change after November the 5th. So I don't think that's important. I'm assuming that Israel wants to get all of its ducks in a row. I think it wants to launch a very big strike, or at least a big in the sense that it's going to hurt Iran seriously, whether hitting its oil refineries or maybe again its nuclear facilities. And you know, they're also trying to get their ducks in a row with the Americans in preparation for the inevitable Iranian retaliation. So I think that's why they're delaying it. They're just basically making all preparations for it. But I imagine it's going to happen very soon. And I again imagine, I don't think it's going to be a pro forma. I don't think it's going to be, well, we'll just knock out a few anti-ballistic missile systems. You know, I think they're going to go for something big. I think they're going to hit, at the very least, they're going to hit Iran's oil refineries, try to hurt Iran economically. Anyway, Cynthia, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you for your generosity. So Cynthia says, it seems to me like the Israelis are way too weak and wimpish to engage in direct combat. Well, I think that's absolutely true. I think there's the Israelis do not like doing that. They don't like to get into direct combat. They've always been hesitant. They want to use their air power. They want to use their missiles. They want to use their technological prowess to cause absolute destruction and mayhem and misery wherever they go. I mean, that's always the case. If you get into direct combat, then your people get killed. And Israel really doesn't like that. They hate it when their people get killed, and they hate it even when their people are taken hostage. I mean, they people, you know, it's like, look at all this, you know, agonizing that's been going on all this time about the hostages. So, you know, the Israelis, you know, like their view is, you know, we are such special people, you know, that, you know, we cannot lose our people's lives. We can destroy everyone else's lives, but, you know, non-Jewish lives, you know, they're worth nothing. But our lives are precious, and that's their views. And, you know, our lives are precious, and that's why they cannot go in. If you go into Lebanon, you know, that's a cauldron. You know, they're going to lose lives very quickly. And they didn't really do that in Gaza either. I mean, they've lost some lives, but basically they've just been pulverizing Gaza. And that's the way Israelis fight their wars. They just pulverize their opponents. And then Cynthia goes on, if I'm right about that, wouldn't Hezbollah have a much better chance of defeating the Israelis by drawing them into a land war? No, I think that's right. I think that's what they were doing. And I think that's what Nasrallah was saying. I mean, I think in his last speech before he was assassinated, he said, you know, to the Israelis, please invade. please come in. You're welcome in Lebanon. Please, then, because he knows the Israelis do not want to do this. They didn't want to do it in 2006. They've never wanted to do this. They always use their technological prowess to avoid loss of life on their side. So, but he said, yeah, you want to invade? Yeah, come on over, invade. So, so I think there's no question that Hezbollah has absolutely wanted them to do that. I mean, I think, what are they trying to do now? I think they do want to create a kind of a buffer zone in South Lebanon. Don't know if they can do it. They've tried to do that before, creating the buffer zone so that Israelis can live safely in northern Israel. The problem with that is that the missiles, they can just move. Hezbollah can move its missiles into northern Lebanon, and these missiles, they're still going to be able to reach Israel. Doesn't matter where you put them. You move them, a couple of 100 miles north. They're still going to be able to reach Israel. So that still doesn't buy Israel's security, and I think that's why Israel knows this. Okay, in the old days, yeah, you can just get yourself a buffer zone, and then you'll be safe. But I mean, once you got medium range missiles, those missiles are still going to be able to hit Israeli territory. So that's right. I mean, so if these people who were living in northern Israel were suffering from missile attacks, then it obviously means that the Iron Dome wasn't protecting these people. And that means if the Iron Dome isn't foolproof, and it obviously isn't foolproof, then it doesn't matter. You can, they can, the Israelis can move up to the Litani River, can go further north. They can just move the missiles further on and keep lobbing them against Israel. So that's why Israel is continually feeling they want a political change in Lebanon. That's their goal. It's not, a buffer zone isn't enough for them. They need a political change, something that will bring Hezbollah under control. They came, they didn't, they came close to it in 1982 to turn Lebanon into a satellite of Israel. It's going to be very hard to do it now. I mean, I guess their idea is that we can terrorize Lebanon and then compel the Lebanese government to be a satellite of Israel's, and that the Lebanese government will crack down on Hezbollah. Basically, it tells Hezbollah, get the hell out of here. You go sling your hook. You're making life for the Lebanese really miserable. You're bringing death and destruction. So we can get rid of Hezbollah. That's the Israeli calculation, I imagine, that they're going to get a government in Beirut that will throw out Hezbollah. I don't think it's likely, but I imagine that is Israel's calculation. Then by drawing that, and isn't it true that you can't declare complete victory over your enemy without conquering them on the ground, especially if your goal is also to take over their land, as it seems to be the case with Israel? So as I say, I think for Israel, their idea is that to try to create governmental change. I mean, I think and that was also the cause in all their previous wars in Lebanon, is to get a government in place in Beirut that will, in 1982, is to get a government in place in Beirut that will throw out the Palestinians. And in this case, to get a government in Beirut that will deal with Hezbollah. So to tell Hezbollah, I mean, just like it's more or less their calculation with Hamas. They're basically trying to tell, the people of Gaza, hey, look what we've done to you. Look at how we've destroyed this land of yours. Look how much death and destruction we have wrought. Look how many of you are now dead. Minimum of 42,000. Look how many children are now dead. Do you want some more? You want more of this? Well, if you don't, then get rid of Gaza, get rid of Hamas. I think that's what they're going to do. That we're trying to do in Lebanon, which is, hey, get rid of Hezbollah. So it's not like, I mean, you're right. I mean, they can't occupy Lebanon. They just don't have the manpower to occupy the whole of Lebanon. It's just not doable. What they're hoping is to get a client government in place in Beirut that will that, because it's just somebody, we can't be destroyed, we can't be bombed, we can't be turned into Gaza, which is what Israel is telling Lebanon. You see what we did in Gaza, we can do the same thing to your country. You don't, do you want to be turned into complete rubble? We can turn Lebanon into rubble. If you don't want Lebanon to be rubble, deal with Hezbollah. I think that's what Israel is doing. I don't think it wants to occupy anything. I think it's just essentially putting a gun to the Lebanese government's head and saying, now, deal with Hezbollah. Anyway, Cynthia goes on. Another thing, George, why is there a lot of direct combat taking place in the war in Ukraine, whereas there's hardly any of it at all taking place in the war in Gaza and Lebanon? Does it have anything to do with the landmass of Ukraine being much larger and far less densely populated than it is for Lebanon, and particularly for Gaza? Could it also have something to do with the fact that the war in Gaza and Lebanon involves non-state actors, which it isn't the case for the war in Ukraine? Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, Russia chose not to fight this war in the way Israel has fought the war, because I think initially I think Russia did fight it in that way. I think the goal was overthrow Zelensky, install a puppet regime, get them to sign an agreement, and then that's it. Then we've achieved our objectives. Once they didn't succeed in that shock and awe strategy of causing complete chaos and panic inside Kiev, which would have compelled them to sign a deal with Russia. Once that was gone, not sure what that was, once that happened, then essentially they didn't have the forces in place to survive. I mean, because there would be a counteroffensive against the Russian forces that were essentially very thinly spread out. They were as you say, Ukraine's a big country. It's the biggest country in Europe. The Russian forces were thinly spread out. So if Ukraine were to mount a counteroffensive, the Russians would be defeated. So once they realized that, they withdrew their forces from Kiev, and then chose to take over the territories of the Donbass. So that goal, the initial goal of trying to overthrow the government in Kiev, was abandoned, and Russia then adopted a different goal, which was to essentially conquer the Donbass, to take over the territories of Donetsk and Lugansk, and then eventually Kherson and Zaporozhye, take them over, drive out the Ukrainian forces, and then incorporate them within the Russian Federation. So it's a very different objective from that of Israel. I think Israel, as all along, is just to force your adversaries to accept the realities, which is that you don't ever defy Israel. You don't ever not do what Israel wants you to do. Russia, I think, after not achieving its goals around Kiev, then decided, well, okay, well, now we're going to take over this territory and incorporate it within the Russian Federation. So that does require essentially man-to-man combat. You wouldn't, with that objective in mind, just bombing isn't going to do you anything. I mean, the bombing which Israel does, it's the whole purpose of that is to demoralize and essentially turn your adversary's land into rubble, and then just force them to say, well, there's nothing we can do. I mean, there's no country here left. So that I think is the Russian objective, was just to take this land over. I mean, there's no point in turning the Donbass into rubble if you intend to incorporate it into the Russian Federation. So that's why they've pursued this strategy. But by doing that, it's of course a very casualty rich situation. I mean, it's like huge loss of lives, because it really is, you're mounting attacks against well fortified locations. They've been well fortified, really, thanks to NATO. This has been going on for since 2014. And so essentially, the Russians are just running up against well-fortified targets, and that's why they're suffering these huge casualties. So I think it's because the Russians' objectives, I think, are different from Israel's objectives, and I think that's why this is it's caused this huge loss of life. Initially, I think Russia's objectives were very similar, which is to compel the government to essentially do the Russians bidding. Now, of course, Israel, their goal really, when they launched their attack on Gaza after October the 7th, I think, was to cause as much misery as possible. I mean, partly it was revenge for what Hamas had done on October the 7th. But the other part of it is try to make Gaza as unlivable as possible. Try to force the residents of Gaza out. I mean, just to sort of, there's no future for you here. I mean, I think maybe Israel had wanted to ethnically cleanse Gaza, just drive them into the Sinai. That just wasn't on, because the Egypt wasn't going to accept this, and no one was going. Even the Americans weren't going to accept it. They can't just drive out 2 million people. I mean, what are you going to do with 2 million people? So it just wasn't doable. But what was doable was to turn Gaza into rubble, and I think that part was just Israel. It's within Israel's capabilities. Israel has the technological know-how, and it doesn't really require too much by way of loss of life. But that wasn't how Russia wants to decide. Well, okay, we're not going to take Kiev. We're not going to remove Zelensky. We'll just take over this territory and incorporated them into the Russian Federation. Well, if you're doing that, there's no real, you actually have to physically take over the territory. Just destroying it and turning it into rubble, there's no, there's no point in incorporating rubble into your territory. So I think that's why they're so different. Now, where are we? Yes, so we got Robert, who says, in keeping with your recent prediction that Trump will eke out a victory, Polymarket is breaking bigly for Trump, putting him at 55.8 versus Harris 45.3. I wonder if Harris's call for restraint on the part of Israel, however equivocal, is causing the Zionist donor class to get behind Trump. I think that's true. I think that is the case. The Zionist donor class has generally been quite supportive of Trump. Some of these hedge fund guys, they have put some money behind Trump. And I think that also explains why Trump has been, we were talking about the other day, why Trump has been so fanatical in his support for Israel. He's not going to get the Jewish vote, but he's going to get some money from these Zionist donors. And these people are absolutely crazy, and they're convinced that Harris, as you say, however equivocal, Harris will empower all these Democrat Hamas supporters, all these, Democrat voters who are basically on the side of Hamas, and Harris is going to try to appease them. So yeah, absolutely, they don't want to take any risks on Harris. But that, I think, doesn't affect the vote. I mean, I think the Jewish vote will still overwhelmingly break for Harris. I think what it does affect is the money. I think it's going to help money, and Harris has still generated a lot more donations than Trump has. I mean, she's really overwhelmingly raising a lot more money than Trump has. I mean, that isn't translating into votes necessarily for her, but it's getting her dollars. So it would it's understandable why Trump should worry about the lack of funds coming into the Republican coffers. And so I think that's why he is cultivating these big Zionist donors. And so, but I think Harris is just not impressive. She goes on these shows, when The View, and then she was on Colbert, and then was it Call Her Daddy, and then Howard Stern. But the problem is she just hasn't done well even on those shows, and I think that is hurting her. You probably saw that she was on The View, and then when she was asked the question, which you would have thought she will be prepared for this question. Well, how would you be different from Biden? And then Colbert also asked her, well, how would you be different from Biden? And she seemed completely unable, in either case, when she was asked the question on The View or on Colbert, unable to answer that question, which is a very basic question. I mean, you're the vice president, and you're saying, I'm the candidate of change, a ridiculous cliche, to begin with. Bill Clinton was the one who just kept talking about change, but ever since then, every candidate has talked about change, but Bill Clinton was the one for change. But to Colbert, she said, "Oh well, I'm different from Biden." So that's the way she just, well, I'm physically different. Biden's a man and I'm a woman, and Biden's older than I am, so it was a ridiculous answer. And then the answer to The View was even worse, because she said, well, I can't think of it in any way in which I would have done anything differently from Biden. And it was a strange thing, because you would have thought that you could easily answer that question by saying something like, well, there were certain things that we didn't get right. Just say, look, we should have done more on gun control. I don't know what more, because we should have done more. We didn't press hard enough. Or maybe we should have closed the border, tightened the border earlier than we did. In other words, you can always just say that, well, we tried to do these things, but we didn't press hard enough. I mean, in all sorts of ways that we should have, we didn't do everything that we could have done. At least it's an answer to the question. But if you say, well, I can't think of anything that I would have done differently, then how are you the agent of change? How are you the candidate for change? So if you go into these very friendly venues and you can't answer really a very basic question, then she looks unimpressive. And that's the problem. And it's the problem that she had, that Hillary Clinton had, that Hillary Clinton really had nothing to offer. It's just, basically, she was an empty pantsuit. And Harris is also an empty pantsuit. It's like, well, what do I need to say in order to get people to vote for me? What do I need to say in order to keep the right and the important people happy? And that's the mentality of Hillary Clinton. She had no ideas at all. She knew that she wanted to be president very much. She knew that she was entitled to be president, but she didn't quite know why she should be president, other than that she's entitled to it. So that's why, everyone consents that there was something very phony about Hillary Clinton, that she doesn't really believe anything, and she'll say whatever she thinks needs to be said in order to keep rich people happy, in order to get people to vote for her. And I think people picked up on that, and why they disliked her so much. And I suspect they're picking this up with Harris, and they don't like Harris for that same reason. I mean, ultimately, we can say with absolute certainty that if tomorrow, the CIA, the National Security Agency, all the deep state people went into Harris's office and said, all this stuff we've been talking about Israel, forget all that. It's much more important for us to placate the Arab world. We need the Arab world on our side because we're about to launch a war against Russia. We want everyone of the global South to be on our side. We have to abandon Israel. We want the global South to be on our side. We have to abandon Israel. I mean, I'm not saying they're going to come up. Obviously, they're not going to make that argument. But if they went to Harris tomorrow and said that, Harris will immediately abandon Israel. Same with Hillary Clinton. They would, without hesitation, they would abandon Israel. And that just shows that they don't have any core beliefs. I mean, Trump, I think, has some core beliefs, but they don't. And I think voters pick up on it. And I think voters are now coming to not like Harris very much. Just, they're just not liking her. So whatever enthusiasm there was initially, I think as the voters have become getting used to her, they just don't like her. And that's why I think that it's going to swing to Trump. I think, no question, Trump has not run a good campaign. There's all sorts of things that are wrong with it. His shilling for Israel is disgusting. But people will still ultimately say, well, at least there's something authentic about him. And there's nothing authentic about Harris. So that's why I think he's going to eke out a victory. Marty, thank you very much for your generosity. Really appreciate it. Good evening, George and Gagglers. Really appreciate it. And then Marty very generously always does this. He posts that piece of paper which I was talking about, the piece of paper between Stalin and Churchill, and the if you can just see it here when they talk about the 90% to 10% for Romania, and then the Hungary, but the Hungary was changed. So that was the first version. The Hungary is 50-50, and then it was changed to 75-25. Because they just said Churchill obviously thought it was ridiculous that the British influence in Hungary would be the same with the Soviet Union, where the Red Army would run the place. But there it is. It's a fascinating historical document in Churchill wrote down the percentages agreement, but that essentially indicated that the Western powers accepted the division of Europe and the consignment of Eastern Europe to Soviet influence. So when people talk about the Yalta, whatever, this was before the Yalta conference. That was the percentages agreement. But anyway, here it's like Hungary is 50-50, but that was changed to Hungary 75. But Yugoslavia was, basically 50-50. It's up for grabs. And Stalin did not bring Yugoslavia under control. He may have thought that he would be able to do it. He would bring Yugoslavia under control. He failed to do so. And then Yugoslavia, though communist, began cultivating the West, and the West cultivated Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia became a kind of a de facto ally of the West. So 50-50 more or less summed up the situation for Yugoslavia after the war. So again, Stalin kept his side of the bargain. Anyway, and Richard Phillips says Hess was crazy, and yeah, in my opinion, I agree. I think that was because I don't believe Hitler would have signed off on such a stupid, ridiculous mission. And then Steve says, why was Hess kept incommunicado for the rest of his life? I think that was just simply sadism on the part of the Allies. Yeah, so I didn't really understand it. I mean, once he was there, I mean, he was harmless. I mean, essentially from 1941 on, he really had played no role at all in the Nazi regime, and there was, there was really, I mean, I don't even know why he was kept in prison all that time. I mean, given that Albert Speer, who was much more involved in war crimes than Rudolf Hess was, but Albert Speer was released after 20 years. Not quite sure why they needed to keep Speer in prison, until his death. I mean, there were any number of times when, just out of humanitarianism, what just let him live out the last few years of his life at home. No, they just kept him in prison. So I think it was just sadism. So Richard says maybe the authorities didn't want people to know that he was still alive. I mean, this was known. It was known about that he was alive. It was kind of an amusing little episode stemming from World War II. There's still Spandau. I mean, they kept that prison going, Spandau, and there was only one prisoner. There was no one else at Spandau. So I mean, it really was quite sadistic because, I mean, essentially it was solitary confinement. I mean, he didn't. There were no other prisoners there. He never communicated with anyone, and so it was. It was clearly sadism. It's torture. But when it came to the Nazis, nobody really cared about sadism and torture. And you say, even though these are supposed to be, we have values, but whether it's Hess or anyone else, I mean, keeping anyone in solitary confinement for years and years and years is torture. I mean, there's no question. I mean, it's obviously torture. I mean, so it was. I mean, it's terrible what they did to him, and really, there was no need for it. There was really no need for it. I mean, he hadn't been involved really in any of the Nazi crimes since he was in prison since 1941. Steve says everyone knew he was alive. So Steve says they want to use their air power, except it all comes from the U.S. Exactly. And then Stone River, thank you very much for your generosity. Truancy penance attached. Well, it's good to see you here anyway. So you are forgiven. So don't worry. And Richard Phillips says the left is no longer a safe bet for Zionists. There's too much pressure from the far left pro-Palestinians. I think that that's true, and that while I think intellectually, politically, there's not a significant movement. It is votes. Votes are involved in that, and I think if they really came to having a powerful voice in the party in the United States, I think they would get the same treatment that Jeremy Corbyn got. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, what did him in was his long history of supporting the Palestinian cause. I mean, he got to be leader of the party. It's unthinkable that somebody like Corbyn, somebody who has been a stalwart supporter of the Palestinians, now got to be party leader, and so naturally the deep state and everybody went in to try to destroy him. So initially, if you recall, they did it by suggesting that Corbyn was a secret communist, Corbyn was working for the Kremlin, and all this nonsense. And then, oh, Corbyn's anti-Semitic. He's anti-Semitic. And I think that's what they're going to do to if the pro-Palestinians were to become an influential force among the Democrats. And I think we're a long, long way from anything like that. But so, in a way, so hysterical is the pro-Zionist wing in American politics that even a few mumblings here and there, from Harris, I mean, who's done nothing, he said nothing, but a few mumblings about Palestinian rights or that Palestinians are humans and we got a Palestinian suffering. Even saying that, even to bring up Palestinian suffering, is just guaranteed to enrage the Zionist donors, the Zionist fat cats, and compelling them to donate their money to Trump. So I think I don't think that those a pro-Palestinian faction among the Democrats has much chance of prevailing within the party. But at least in the Democrats there is that faction. In the Republicans there isn't. Not even the, sort of the slightest whisper of that among the Republicans. And then Summer Petros, thank you very much for your generosity. Really appreciate that. And so that so anyway, I think my time is up, and thank you everybody who has joined me. Thank you for all of your really interesting questions. Good, very good questions. Really good. Really we have to think about them, and they're very, very challenging. So thank you, everybody, and we will obviously do that this again next Tuesday. Thank you above all to the those who contributed to the tip jar. As I always say, Wednesdays and Fridays is when I have to face the dogs. And, I've sold many times. They have an extraordinarily low opinion of me, so it's always painful for me to try to explain myself and my shortcomings to them. They're very unsympathetic listeners. So but thank you anyway. It's for your generous contributions. So over the weekend, Peter and I will record some more podcasts, and on Monday we will have a live stream jointly with Peter, and then on Tuesday it will be time for my solo. So thank you for today. Have a good weekend, and see you in a few days. Thanks you. Good night.